The summer of 1187 did not arrive quietly over the Holy Land. It descended like a furnace door swung open, flooding the hills of Galilee with a heat that bent the horizon and turned every breath into labor. For nearly a century, Christians had ruled these lands under the banner of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. To the pilgrims of Europe, it was the Kingdom of God. The shining jewel won by the First Crusade, the sacred foothold of Christendom in the East. But by July 1187, that kingdom no longer shone. It trembled. Its borders had shrunk. Its armies were fractured. Its nobles fought one another more fiercely than they fought their enemies. And its greatest commanders, those who once marched with conviction and discipline, had been replaced by men driven by pride, fear, or desperation. Across the Jordan Valley, another force watched patiently. Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, had united Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Arabia under a single banner of Islam. He was not simply a king. He was a symbol, the long-awaited leader who would heal the divisions of the Muslim world and reclaim Jerusalem for the faithful. For years, Saladin had fought a war of patience, cutting supply lines, seizing fortresses, and wearing down the Crusader state piece by piece. The Christians still held Jerusalem, but they held it the way a man clings to a rope already frayed in his hands. And in the heat of that July, Saladin saw what he had waited for. His enemy weakened, his enemy divided, his enemy desperate. The spark of war did not come from a battlefield. It came from a man already infamous across the East, Reynald de Chatillon, the Lord of Kerak, a Crusader noble whose raids on Muslim caravans violated every truce, every treaty, every pledge of honor sworn on the cross itself. Reynald attacked a pilgrimage caravan returning from Mecca, seizing families, merchants, and sacred travelers. It was an insult Saladin could not ignore. The Sultan swore an oath. He would not lay down his sword until he had destroyed Reynald and the kingdom that protected him. But the disaster that would come, the catastrophe that would reduce the Kingdom of Jerusalem to ashes, did not begin with Saladin's vengeance. It began with a single call for war issued from Jerusalem itself. In early summer, messengers rode through the Christian towns with a proclamation to defend the Holy Land. Every knight, every squire, every man able to hold a spear was ordered to assemble. The king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, feared that Tiberias, held by Count Raymond of Tripoli, would be Saladin's first target. If Tiberias fell, the entire kingdom might collapse. Under the burning sun, the Crusader host gathered at Sephoria, knights in heavy mail, men at arms carrying long spears, Hospitaller and Templar commanders in black and white mantles, priests bearing relics and chanting prayers. The air buzzed with tension, because even here, even on the eve of war, the kingdom was not united. Raymond argued that the army should not march. The land was too dry, the heat too severe, Saladin too well positioned. Others, driven by pride or by the arrogance of righteousness, claimed that God himself would not permit defeat. At the center of the camp, guarded by clergy and soldiers alike, stood the most sacred relic of the Crusader world, the true cross. Believed to hold a fragment of the cross on which Christ had been crucified, it was carried into battle only in the gravest moments. Its presence meant one thing: a kingdom was preparing for a reckoning. and believed heaven would stand with them. But heaven was silent, and the desert was waiting. Soon, the Crusader army would march into the heat, into the open, into a trap Saladin had spent years preparing. And the battle that would follow, Hattin, would decide the fate of Jerusalem itself. The road to Hattin did not begin on the morning of July 3, 1187. It began months earlier, quietly, invisibly, shaped by choices no army could reverse once swords were drawn. The kingdom of Jerusalem stood fragile, held together not by unity, but by a truce as thin as dry parchment. Saladin had signed it, reluctantly. The Crusader barons had accepted it, resentfully, and the land itself, parched by drought, stripped of crops, weary from decades of marching boots, waited for the moment when the truce would fail. It failed because of a single man. His name was Reynald of Chatillon, a French warlord whose hatred for Islam ran deeper than his loyalty to his own king. While the truce was still in effect, Reynald attacked a Muslim caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. He seized their gold, their camels, their families, ignoring the treaty entirely. Saladin demanded justice. Reynald laughed, and so, a war that no one wanted became a war that no one could stop. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem knew what Saladin's gathering forces meant. It meant jihad. It meant retribution. It meant that the fragile kingdom, held by only a few thousand knights, would have to stand against the full weight of the Ayyubid Empire. King Guy of Lusignan, newly crowned and widely distrusted, received the first reports in his fortress at Sephoria. Saladin is moving north. The tribes are answering his call. Tiberius will be the first to fall. Guy's advisors were divided. Raymond of Tripoli, cautious and seasoned, argued that the Crusaders should hold their defensive positions. "Let Saladin exhaust himself," he urged. "He cannot besiege what he cannot reach." But others, the hot-blooded nobles, the men who feared dishonor more than death, pushed in the opposite direction. They demanded action. Among them was the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gérard de Riedfort, whose ambition burned brighter than his judgment. "Saladin threatens Tiberius," he declared, "and a king who refuses to aid his own vassals invites rebellion." His voice carried weight, too much weight. King Guy wavered, torn between prudence and pride. And Saladin, watching from beyond the Jordan, tightened his trap. When the news arrived that Tiberius itself was under siege, that Saladin's catapults were battering the citadel where Raymond's own wife was trapped, every hesitation collapsed beneath the crushing weight of expectation. The Crusader army marched. 1,200 knights, 3,000 mounted sergeants, and thousands of foot soldiers gathered around the true cross, the relic carried into every major battle of the Crusader states. It glittered in the sunlight, swaying above their ranks. Some saw holiness, others saw fate, but none saw the danger waiting beyond the hills. Saladin had chosen the battlefield long before the Crusaders left Sephoria. He knew the land. He knew the heat. He knew the distances between wells. He knew the places where the summer sun turned stone into an anvil and men into embers. And so he let the Crusaders march, not toward Tiberius, but toward the Horns of Hattin. Two volcanic hills standing above a dry plateau where the wind carried no moisture and no mercy. From the moment the Crusaders left Sephoria, everything began to unravel. The July heat was brutal, their water supplies low, their horses weakening. Saladin's cavalry hovered around them like shadows, never attacking, never dispersing, only watching, always waiting. It was a kind of warfare the Crusaders hated. One where they could not charge, could not crush, could not force a decisive engagement. They were being herded. By nightfall, smoke filled the air. Saladin had ordered grass fires lit across the plains, letting the wind push the choking heat toward the Crusader line. Men coughed, horses panicked. The true cross wavered in the shimmering haze. When dawn broke on the second day, the Crusaders saw what they had not understood the day before. They were surrounded. Saladin had closed every path to the Sea of Galilee, every well, every stream, every hope of escape. Archers lined the eastern ridge. Cavalry waited on the western slope. Black banners snapped in the morning wind. And directly ahead of them stood the volcanic hill known as the Horns of Hattin, their only refuge, and the place where they would die if they chose it. Some whispered the kingdom was finished. Others clutched their swords. But all eyes turned to the true cross, glowing faintly under the rising sun. They were trapped, but they were not yet defeated. Not yet. The sun over Galilee carried a weight that did not belong to the month of July. Chroniclers later wrote that the heat felt unnatural, as if drawn from the breath of the desert itself. But for the Crusader army marching east from Sephoria, the day began as any other campaign day had begun. Dust rising from the hooves of knights, the slow grind of infantry, the metallic clatter of mail heating beneath the sun. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, a danger was taking form. The kingdom of Jerusalem, what remained of it, was moving not by wisdom, but by pride. Guy of Lusignan, newly crowned king, had little of Baldwin IV's measured caution. Influenced by Reynald of Chatillon's hot vows for vengeance, and urged on by the military orders, he made a decision that would bend the fate of the Latin kingdom toward ruin. He marched the entire army, 20,000 men, into the open, toward the Sea of Galilee, where Saladin was waiting. There were safer strategies. The Templars urged restraint. The barons of Jerusalem warned that the wells were few. Even the Hospitallers counseled delay. But Guy, haunted by the fear of appearing weak, demanded that the kingdom of God stand tall before the armies of Islam. He believed force of will could overcome lack of water. He believed the cross could overcome exhaustion. He believed that God would honor his courage. What he did not understand, what he could not understand, was that Saladin had hoped for this very march. The Sultan was not waiting behind fortress walls. He was bleeding the land dry, scorching every blade of grass between the Franks and Tiberias. His cavalry circled like hunting birds, never striking, only pushing, herding, bending the Crusaders away from the safety of Sephoria and toward the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin. By midday, men were drinking the sweat from their own armor. By nightfall, the army slept without water. There were battles that shaped kingdoms, and then there were marches, slow, deliberate, suffocating, that shaped destinies. The march to Hattin was the latter. Before dawn, a wind moved across the Crusader camp. but it brought no relief. It was the dry wind from the east, the desert's breath, blowing dust into the mouths of men who had not tasted water since morning. The Crusaders rose not with discipline, but with desperation. Their leather shields had stiffened in the night air. Their horses stood trembling, snorting dust. The infantry rose slowly, like men waking in a world not meant for them. Then they saw it. A ring of fire. Saladin's forces had used the night to encircle them, torching the scrubland around Hattin. Smoke rose from every direction. Arrows whistled from behind the haze. The sound of drums echoed through the smoke wall, a slow, deliberate cadence, like a heartbeat the Franks did not recognize. The Crusader army had been caught inside a furnace. Guy ordered a push toward the Horns, higher ground, where the true cross could be lifted above the chaos. The cross had always been a rallying point, but on this morning, something felt different. The men who followed it no longer believed they were marching toward victory. They believed they were marching toward survival. Saladin's cavalry did not strike in force. Instead, they closed the noose, tightening the dust and smoke until the Crusader ranks blurred into shapeless masses. The Franks leaned on their shields. Some fell to their knees. Others collapsed where they stood. Heat was their first enemy. Thirst was the second. But the third, the one Saladin relied on most, was panic. When the Templars attempted a charge to break the encirclement, they were met not by resistance, but by retreat. The Muslim cavalry simply opened their lines, drawing the knights further from the Crusader corps. Then, like the snap of a trap, the gap closed behind them. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a tightening spiral, a slow collapse of a Christian kingdom under the weight of its own exhaustion. On the ridge above, the Horns of Hattin loomed, two volcanic hills where fate was waiting to be written. The climb toward the Horns was less a march and more a crawl. Knights abandoned their horses. Infantry staggered upward with shields dragging behind them. Standard bearers sank to the ground, clutching their banners like lifelines. The true cross, once a radiant emblem of Christendom's hope, hung low in the hands of its bearers. Its golden frame caught only faint light through the smoke. Saladin watched from a distance, mounted on a ridge, surrounded by emirs who understood what was unfolding. This was not the victory of a single battle. This was the unraveling of a kingdom. By midday, the Crusader formation broke, not from enemy blades, but from thirst that turned discipline into chaos. The infantry formation split along its center. Some attempted to flee downhill. Others tried to form a shield wall on the slope. Knights pushed through their own ranks, desperate to break the encirclement. But the heat crushed their momentum. Then Saladin gave the order. The Muslim cavalry charged, not as scattered raiders, but as a single, unified spear. Arrows fell like a desert storm. The flanks of the Crusader army folded inward. Men fell in clumps. Horses collapsed in their harnesses. Even the Templars, shielded by discipline, could no longer hold formation against the pressure. The hilltop became a grave of shattered shields and abandoned helms. Near the summit, the final stand formed around the true cross. The Bishop of Acre lifted it high, his hands trembling. But the wind was against him. Smoke blew across the ridge, turning the cross into a silhouette. A dark outline, against a sky the color of burnt copper. A final Templar charge attempted to break through to the relic. It failed. The Sultan's guards swept around them, and the last defenders of the cross collapsed under a rain of arrows. When the banner of King Guy fell, the Latin kingdom fell with it. The cross was taken. The king was taken. The kingdom built on the promise of God had turned to ashes on the volcanic stones of Hattin. The sun over Galilee did not rise that morning. It ascended, slow, merciless, like a blade pulled from its sheath. By the time its light touched the plateau of Hattin, the Crusader army was already breaking. Raymond of Tripoli tried to keep a line, any line at all, forming his knights on the eastern ridge. But the men no longer moved like soldiers. They moved like men who had been emptied. Their shields were too hot to hold. Their throats were open wounds, every breath scraped like sandpaper. And everywhere, rose the sound of something that did not belong on a battlefield. The coughing of dying horses. The Templars attempted a final charge down the slope, hoping to punch a corridor to the waters of Lake Tiberias. For a moment, just a moment, they looked like the knights of old. Shields forward, lances low, the white mantles with blood-red crosses snapping in the wind. But Saladin had been waiting for that exact charge. Turkish archers stepped into position. Their bowstrings curved back in one unified motion, like a single lung inhaling. And the volley that followed was not a rain. It was a storm that had chosen a target. Horses collapsed mid-stride. Lances dropped before ever touching an enemy. Knights crashed into one another as momentum turned to chaos. Behind them, the true cross, the relic carried into battle as the beating heart of the Crusader Kingdom, began to tilt. Its bearers tried to steady it. They failed. From Saladin's vantage point, the sight was unmistakable. The spiritual standard of the Franks was sinking into the dust. The Muslim infantry surged forward, no longer holding the center, but crushing it. Their shields hammered the Crusader line. Spears struck through open gaps, and still the heat rose, swallowing the hill, suffocating every man who stood upon it. Knights looked to King Guy for a command that no longer existed. Some begged him to retreat, others begged him to attack. But he could barely hold his sword. His fingers were too swollen from dehydration to close around the hilt. The hill that had once been a defensive position had become a furnace. And in that furnace, the kingdom of Jerusalem, born in fire, was beginning to melt. From the western ridge, Saladin gave a single command. 1,000 drums answered. 1,000 voices rose, and the circle began to close. Hattin was no longer a battle. It was a slow tightening of fate. A kingdom being strangled under the open sky. Night fell over Hattin not as a blanket, but as a shroud. What remained of the Crusader army, once the pride of Jerusalem, huddled together beneath a sky that offered no mercy. No wind, no clouds, only the distant glow of torches flickering along the ridges. Saladin had encircled them fully. He did not need to attack. He only needed to wait. The horns of the Ayyubid camp rose and fell like waves, long, low, deliberate notes drifting across the dry hills. Each echo reminded the Crusaders of what they lacked: water, strength, direction, and hope. The dead lay where they had fallen. The dying whispered prayers that melted into the dust. The living tried not to think about sunrise, because sunrise meant death. In the early hours before dawn, when the world becomes a single color, Saladin gave the order, not to charge, not to surround, but to ignite. Across the plain, Ayyubid soldiers dragged bundles of dry brushwood and thorn bushes, piling them around the Crusader encampment like a noose woven from the land itself. A spark touched the timber, and the ring of fire came to life. Flames surged outward first, then inward, smoke pouring downward into the enemy ranks, filling lungs already cracked from dehydration. The Crusaders coughed, staggered, clutched their throats. Shields became useless, armor became an oven. Every breath tasted of burning resin and death. Some knights tried to break out, running blindly into the darkness. Arrows met them before they even knew which direction they moved. Others crouched low, cloaks pressed over their faces, trying to breathe through wool soaked with nothing but desperation. The Muslims called out through the fire, "Water! Water for those who surrender." Not one Crusader moved. They would die as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, battered, broken, but unbending. But the fire was patient, and so was Saladin. Raymond of Tripoli stared into the flames, his face lit in trembling orange bands. Guy of Lusignan knelt, whispering to a cross that had long since lost meaning. Hospitaller knights formed a loose circle around the true cross, holding it upright even as their hands blistered and their armor seared their skin. Some claimed later that the wood itself glowed, not with holiness, but with the reflection of Hattin burning. Across the battlefield, Muslim soldiers beat their shields rhythmically, metal against metal, creating a slow, inevitable pulse. It sounded like the heartbeat of the end. When dawn finally cracked the horizon, the fire had done its work. The Crusader army rose, if it could be called rising, swaying, trembling, leaning on shattered spears. Their faces were streaked with soot. Their lips were split. Their eyes reddened. Their banners charred. The kingdom of God looked less like an army and more like men walking out of their own grave. Saladin watched from high ground, his face unreadable. He did not smile. Victory was certain. But what would come next would shape the fate of Jerusalem itself. And the sun, rising mercilessly over Hattin, revealed a truth the Crusaders could not deny. The battle had already ended. The final blow had not yet fallen. But the kingdom had already turned to ashes. The sun had climbed to its violent height. Across the plateau of basalt and dust, the Crusader line, once an army, once a kingdom, now looked like a living ruin. Shields hung limp from hands blistered by heat. Spears trembled in fists too dry to sweat. Horses staggered, their flanks pale with salt, their breath coming in thin, desperate gasps. And all around them, the desert burned, not with flame, but with inevitability. Saladin's army tightened its ring. No charge came, no storm of arrows yet. Only the slow, methodical closing of a fist. From the Muslim lines, horns began to sound, long, low war calls that carried over the dry wind like the moaning of ancient stone. The Crusaders felt the vibration in their armor. It was not simply a signal. It was a reminder. They were surrounded. Raymond of Tripoli, his face carved with exhaustion and fury, turned to look for King Guy. What he found instead was a man already drowning in his own crown, clutching it as if it were a shield, when in truth It weighed heavier than any armor he'd ever worn. "We must break the circle," Raymond insisted. "But break it. With what?" Half the infantry no longer stood in formation. Many knelt, not to pray, but because their legs could no longer carry them. And the water wagons, those precious barrels of life, had been lost hours earlier in the chaos of Saladin's harassment attacks. Across the field, Saladin watched from atop his black Arabian stallion, the same calm presence he had maintained since dawn. His officers weighed the moment, urging him to unleash the full assault. But Saladin waited. He knew what the sun would do, what thirst would do, what hopelessness would do. The Crusaders did not need to be defeated. They only needed to be allowed to understand that they were already lost. By midday, the hilltop, the twin peaks called the Horns of Hattin, was wrapped in a crown of smoke. Saladin's soldiers had set fire to the dry grass below, letting the wind carry choking heat upward toward the Crusader line. With every breath, Christian soldiers inhaled smoke and ash. Eyes stung, vision watered, throats closed. The battlefield felt like the mouth of an oven. The true cross, once held high, once the banner of a kingdom, now leaned, trembling in the hands of the Bishop of Acre. Its golden casing reflected only the brightness of the flames around it, not the hope it once promised. And still, King Guy forced his knights forward. A final charge, a last effort, one more push toward the lake and salvation. But when the cavalry broke forward, they found not freedom, but Saladin's Mamluks, fresh, disciplined, perfectly positioned. The crash of steel was not a clash of armies. It was the shattering of a kingdom. One knight fell, then 5, then 20. Male links scattered across the desert like seeds of a broken harvest. The horses, unable to breathe through the heat, collapsed beneath their riders. Knights fought on foot, hacking upward at mounted opponents who cut them down with the precision of men who had been waiting for this moment all their lives. Raymond tried to cut through the left flank. Balian of Ibelin tried to rally the center. The Hospitallers attempted one final countercharge, but it was like throwing pebbles into a tide. Everything was moving in one direction. Downhill, toward defeat, toward the death of the kingdom God was said to have chosen. Behind them, smoke thickened. Ahead, the ring of steel tightened. And in between, the Crusader army. The pride of Jerusalem, the shield of the Holy Land, finally sagged like a fortress whose walls had cracked. Saladin raised his arm. The signal was given. Arrows darkened the air, hundreds, then thousands, and the hilltop became a forest of falling iron. The sound was not thunder. It was rain. A terrible, violent rain that struck shields, helmets, flesh. Men lifted their arms by instinct. Some prayed, some screamed, some simply stood still, too empty to do anything but wait. The true cross fell. It hit the ground with a wooden crack that echoed through the battlefield like a prophecy fulfilled. King Guy saw it fall and felt the weight of the moment more deeply than he felt the arrows slicing into the men around him. For the first time on that burning day, he knew. Hattin was lost. Jerusalem was next. The kingdom of God had begun to crumble, not with an explosion, but with the quiet, unanswerable collapse of faith meeting reality. And Saladin, watching it happen, simply lowered his gaze, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. History had just changed, and everyone on that hill, Christian and Muslim alike, felt the world shift beneath their feet. The sun that rose over the Horns of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, was not a sunrise. It was a verdict. By the time the light spilled across the basalt hills, the Kingdom of Jerusalem no longer existed in any real sense. Its borders still appeared on maps, its castles still stood on their ridges, and its kings still wore gold. But the kingdom itself, the idea, the faith, the crusading promise forged in 1099, had bled out onto the dry soil beneath the twin hills of Hattin. The armies of Jerusalem had not simply been defeated. They had been unmade. The Templars, those iron pillars of Latin Christendom, were gone. The Hospitallers, keepers of the sick, guards of the Holy Road, were gone. The barons who had ridden through decades of siege and intrigue had fallen within sight of the true cross. Knights, sergeants, pilgrims, priests, all swept into the furnace of Saladin's encirclement. Nothing about the aftermath resembled chivalry. It resembled consequence. Saladin did not waste the victory. He did not celebrate. He did not pause. He turned from the battlefield like a commander who had merely opened the first door of a long corridor. Hattin had given him more than triumph. It had given him momentum. While the captive Guy of Lusignan was escorted into Muslim hands, while the remaining Crusaders were marched away in stunned silence, while the true cross, the holiest relic in the Latin world, was carried off as a prize of war, Saladin moved. Like water down a broken wall, his armies surged across Palestine. Tiberias surrendered without protest. Acre, pride of the coast, folded within weeks. Nablus, Jaffa, Turan, Sidon. Gates opened at the mere sight of his banners. Garrisons in the hills abandoned their posts. Peasants swore allegiance to the new master of the land. The very roads seemed to shift direction, pointing now toward Damascus and Cairo, not Jerusalem. In the chronicles written afterward, European scribes struggled to explain what happened. Some blamed King Guy. Others blamed the barons who pushed him. Others blamed the heat, the thirst, the smoke, the choices, or the fate that seemed to guide the crescent that day. But in the quieter margins of those manuscripts, there is another tone, a whisper of something heavier, something older, that the kingdom had forgotten what had created it. For nearly a century, Jerusalem had survived not on might, nor on numbers, nor on the swords of the West. It had survived on conviction shared by men who believed the city meant more than walls, or relics, or thrones. By 1187, that conviction had thinned. Politics replaced unity, rivalries replaced discipline, luxury replaced ascetic resolve. Faith had become a matter of ceremony, not sacrifice. And in the desert outside Hattin, the bill came due. Saladin did not destroy the kingdom that day. The kingdom had hollowed itself long before he arrived. He simply removed the part that was still standing. When evening settled over the empty battlefield, when the fires of the Muslim camps burned low, when the wind carried away the last smoke of the Christians' desperate charge, one truth remained. A kingdom that had been born in holy fire had died in ordinary flame. It did not collapse from overwhelming force. It collapsed from the absence of what had once held it together, and somewhere among the abandoned shields, the broken spears, and the dust-coated remnants of Crusader cloaks, a single question lingered. Not why the kingdom had fallen, but how it had stayed standing for as long as it did. Because Hattin did not end the kingdom of Jerusalem. It merely revealed that the kingdom's end had been marching beside it for years. The smoke that rose from the fields of Hattin did not drift away quickly. It clung to the hills, to the broken shields, to the ashes of banners that once claimed to be blessed by God. For days, the wind carried only two things across Galilee: the silence of defeat and the certainty that something foundational had collapsed. From Acre to Ascalon, from Jerusalem to the smallest watchtower on the frontier, the same message traveled faster than couriers could ride. The kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its sword. The army sworn to defend the holy city no longer existed. Its knights were gone. Its relics were gone. Its authority, spiritual and political, had been shattered on a hill of volcanic rock. Only a few survivors reached the coast. Some walked, some crawled. All carried the same expression: the stunned, hollow gaze of men who had seen the inevitable arrive and could not stop it. In the courts of Europe, the news fell like a thunderclap. Kings who once ignored Jerusalem suddenly spoke of crusades again. Monks who prayed in quiet cloisters began drafting fiery sermons. And peasants who knew little of the Levant except that Christ had once walked there whispered that the end of days must be near. But inside the remnants of the kingdom of Jerusalem, another emotion prevailed: understanding. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Christians of the Holy Land understood that a kingdom built on sanctity could still fall like any other realm of stone and ambition. Across the desert, Saladin did not celebrate. Chroniclers record that he stood at the summit of the Horns of Hattin and simply looked toward Jerusalem, not in triumph, but in contemplation. He had broken the might of the Crusader Kingdom, yet he knew this victory was not the end of conflict, only the start of something far larger: a reckoning between two visions of God, two claims on the same sacred earth, two histories destined to collide again and again. And so, in the months after Hattin, a question haunted every commander, priest, and pilgrim: if a kingdom founded on holy purpose could burn in a single afternoon, what did that mean for the faith that built it? Jerusalem waited for its fate. Europe braced for the Third Crusade. And the world watched the ashes of Hattin sink into the soil, becoming part of the land that had swallowed so many empires before. In time, historians would call Hattin a military disaster. Clerics would call it divine punishment. Poets would call it destiny. But those who survived knew a truth far simpler and far heavier. The kingdom had fallen not because God abandoned it, but because men believed they could wield God as a weapon. And as the last embers cooled on the plateau, a whisper settled over the battlefield, a warning carried by the wind across the Holy Land. Any kingdom that claims to speak for heaven must someday answer for the earth it burns in that name.